Hi everyone and welcome for another Apitherapy video. This time we'll talk about the queen bee. Because there are many ways of thinking about apitherapy. Yes, of course, there are usage of honey for wounds, there's pollen for nutrition, propolis against viruses and all that. And of course this is very practical, but when we're thinking about therapeutical practices, there's more to it. There's more than just the physical aspect of all that. Because in therapy, very often we have to understand and to place some type of notions in ourselves. Somehow there's some education on ourselves, some self-development happening in therapy, in the practice of therapy. Which is not only physical very, very often. And all therapists will know what I'm talking about, of course. So, one aspect of this with apitherapy is all the teachings that bees are bringing to us. Because there are some really high, amazing principles that are incorporated into how bees are living that we could actually benefit from a lot. Some ways of functioning that are very, very harmonious that they use, that bees are using, that if we understand them well and we see that it's happening in nature, we see that it's nature's intelligence that actually applied this into the life cycles of some animals and specifically bees. They're just amazing. In many, many different cultures and even religions, they're accounted for as a sacred being. And bees are just, you'll see, it's just wonderful. So today, it's a notion regarding the queen bee. And it's actually about her mating habits, which is really something special. So, if we have to talk about mating habits, we have to understand when will a queen bee mate. So, first thing, let's start from the beginning. So we have a hive, a beehive, and in it, of course, we have one queen bee which is laying all the eggs. And so the queen bee is laying the eggs and the beehive is growing and they're bringing in some nectar, they make honey with it, they bring in some pollen, they fill the hive with bee bread from the pollen. So slowly the beehive is growing really well, the queen bee is strong, so she's laying lots of eggs, and the space that the bees had to make their hive is becoming, and also, you know, they're building and building the beehive, building more additional cells made of wax, you know, they're just increasing the size of the beehive itself, and everything gets filled with nectar, pollen, and babies, because that's also where the queen bee is laying the eggs, in those cells. So everything is filled with either larvae, honey, bee bread, and so on, and the beehive is getting really strong and solid, and there's no more room to increase the size of the beehive. At that moment, the queen bee will think, okay, that's time. We reach our maximum size, so it's time for us to split somehow, and it's time for us to swarm. That's the term they'll be using. Well, they don't use it, we do, but that's the idea. We call that swarming. So the queen bee will think it's time to swarm. So in the beehive, she'll release some pheromones that will tell the worker bees to make some new queen bees, literally. So the worker bees will then feed some very young larvae, like when they're just freshly coming out of the egg, that takes about 2 days or 3. And at that moment, they'll start feeding that very young larvae right from the start, only with royal jelly. Usually, there's a tiny bit of royal jelly when the worker bees are raising, let's say, other worker bees. They usually feed them a tiny bit of royal jelly and then bee bread. But for queen bee, they feed only royal jelly all the time. And royal jelly is so amazing, it can actually act on the genes of the bees, and it changes the entire animal, the entire insect, from becoming a worker bee to becoming a queen bee. Just the fact that it's eating royal jelly all the time. as I said, it triggers some genes in the bee, and the whole thing is happening. And the whole metamorphosis of that bee, it will grow as an adult queen bee. When that happens, when that queen bee is ready to hatch from that cell where she has been living her entire metamorphosis, then the actual mother queen bee is still in that hive. And very often, at that moment, she already stopped eating for a couple days, and also she probably stopped laying eggs as well for a couple days, just in order to lose some weight and be more light for her flight, because she's gonna go out of the hive and she'll gather, a solid portion of that beehive in terms of worker bees. She'll gather them with her, and they will fly away, and they will create a new beehive somewhere else. And we call that swarming. When we see a swarm of bees, it's those bees, like it's a powerful mother queen bee that is going away with, let's say, about half of the beehive itself, just to create a new beehive somewhere else. So that's how they split, and that's how they multiply, actually, the beehives. So that's one thing. So when she'll be leaving, that queen bee, actually, she'll be hatching. She's hatching already, and there won't be only one of them. Very often, the worker bees will create a few queen bees. Let's say about 10. It varies a lot. Could be a bit less, could be more. They will make a few queen bees. So the first one that hatches will go and destroy the other ones. If there are many hatching at the same time, they will fight to find out which one is the strongest. And the strongest will remain, and she'll become the queen bee of that hive. So you would think she would start right away laying eggs and, making more babies. But before that, she needs to mate. And that's the topic of today. So she's really young adult. She just came out of that queen bee cell where she had her metamorphosis, and right away she'll be thinking about, I need to mate. So usually she'd wait a day or two, at least. It takes a little time for her just to get used to who she is, and make sure there's no other queen bee, that she's the one, she's recognized by the whole beehive, and then she'll get ready for mating. And what will happen, she will get ready, she will come out of the beehive, and she will release lots of pheromones, and that will tell all male bees, we call them drone bees, all the drone bees will kind of smell this pheromone, and they will detect that pheromone, and they will go and they will follow that queen bee, and they will want to mate with her, of course, and she will fly up above in the sky, really high, and she will then fly so high that just a few drones will be able to keep up with her, and they will get to mate with her. We usually say between 10 and 15 drones will get to mate with the queen bee, and then the queen bee will come back and will start then laying eggs in the beehive, and that will be probably her most important job that she'll be doing in her entire life, just to lay the eggs. And this is huge. It's a lot. She will lay even more than 2,000 eggs per day in full season, so that's really demanding. That's big. Like well, she's the mom of them all, so that will be humongous responsibility. So if we look at it in a closer way, and there's something to remind, because when we think about those, principles that we want to incorporate in our life to work on the therapeutical side of things in apitherapy, which is not only physical, but also some principles we want to think about, want to ponder on, to place a few things in our own life just to see things more harmoniously, and not just with ignorance. We want to have more clarity in our life. Well, if you think about Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner is the one that is at the source of biodynamy. You might know about biodynamy farming. So this is really interesting approach that includes a lot of, very often you are using the moon, where the moon is at, and how she's waxing or waning, and many gardens are planted according to those phases of the moon, right? Well, this is really close, and actually this is very connected with biodynamy. Biodynamy is using this a lot, and it's really connected to that. And Rudolf Steiner had this point of view, connecting living things with the stars, connecting living things with many different subtle aspects of the world, of life. So one thing he was saying about bees was that they are somehow a solar being, specifically the queen bee, and then also the worker bees, and way less the drone bees, the male bees. He was saying they were more terrestrial. And if you ponder on this and you think about it, you'll find out that, yeah, it's really true. So one thing that makes that queen bee very solar as a being is that, yeah, for her nuptial flight, when she is flying out up for mating, she actually flies towards the sun and really, really high above. And that is very special because, yes, a queen bee is a solar being. And that is already a really good sign of that. Also, you know, the bees are flying when it's sunny very often. So a couple connection there. So I'm placing that notion just for another point that is coming, which is when you think about that really well, and when you look at the details of it, for a queen bee to go out for her nuptial flight for mating, of course she'll need some conditions. She'll needs that there's no super strong winds. She'll needs no rain. She'll needs actually a really beautiful day, a really nice and sunny day. And that, you know, is very solar. That's why I was, you know, pointing towards this before, because the bees, the queen bee, will wait for that perfect day in order to go for mating. And this is very, very deep, and this is actually my main point in that video, because as long as the queen bee is not mated, she won't be able to lay more eggs. And you might know that the worker bees have a life, you know, they will live for about 7 weeks or so, you know, and full season. So if the queen bee is not laying eggs, well, the worker bees, some of them will just die, they will grow older, and the more she waits before laying eggs, the weaker the beehive is becoming. Because if she waits, let's say, for 4 weeks, for example, well, it's more than half the bees that are dead at that time. So it's really serious. That waiting period of time is kind of marking a certain decline of the beehive. So there's a really big issue there. But the queen bee still will wait for a perfect day before going out and mate. So this is extremely important, because the queen bee is putting this as a more important point than the decline of a huge amount of bees in the hive, you know, without replacing them, the ones that are getting older, without replacing them by younger ones, by laying the eggs. She's putting at the first place that connection with that, let's say, solar nuptial flight. Well, of course, we could argue and say, well, you know, she needs to do this nuptial flight this way because of 2 reasons. First, there's some kind of natural selection happening, because only the stronger males will get to mate with the queen bee up there, so it's some kind of natural selection. And second, she needs to go out of the beehive, you know, it couldn't be just the drones fighting among each other in the beehive and then mating with the queen, because if she goes out, she can mate with many drones and with drones from other beehives, mixing the genetic basin for the genetic basin source for her babies. So it's not only the same, you know, genetic family reproducing all the time together. So that is actually important. It's kind of vital for the bee species to do this. So yes, of course. But that being said, you know, it's the symbol behind it is so strong that she has to wait for a sunny day. She actually has to wait for good conditions before going for mating. And this is something where we can learn from this a lot. Because you might have heard, you know, if something happens at birth for a baby, sometimes in therapy, you heard that maybe, or in psychology, if something happens to a baby at birth, it will have some kind of influence on that baby, on that person, as the person will grow up. There's some kind of mechanisms that are printed in the mind or somehow in the person, and there will be consequences for this. You might have heard also that it's the same thing during pregnancy. If something happens to the mom or to the baby during that period of time, some say also that that will also have consequences on the development of that baby. One of the most known thing, and everybody agrees on towards the topic, is of course moms should not drink alcohol during pregnancy, because we know that it has a bad influence on the baby. But if you think about it in more details, many things will actually have consequences on the babies. So we could also push things a little bit further and say that it's the same thing for that nuptial flight, for that mating moment. And for humans it's the same thing actually. That moment where there will be the conception of the baby, this is actually important. That's what that queen bee is telling us. That's what she's teaching us, that this moment is actually more important than the potential decline of the beehive. Because as long as the queen bee is not mated, she won't be laying eggs, so there won't be new bees. And if that lasts for a long time, there's a certain decline of the beehive that is happening. But she puts that at the first place, that the conditions of that conception are actually extremely important. And they are number one. They are more important than a potential decline of the beehive. That means for us humans, very often we think, oh, now this is my moment. It's time for me in my life, in my work, you know, the material side of things. You know, I calculated things. It should be now. That's now. You know, this year I'm ready, you know, to have a baby and all this. It's time for me to do this. And we think it this way. We plan it this way. But very often we don't think about the subtle conditions around it. And we think, oh, it's time for me, otherwise it will be too late, or whatever reason we put in our mind. But we don't put those subtle conditions that are actually really important, because they put imprints on this, on the baby and also on ourselves. It's just like if we would be denying the subtle impact of what we go through and what we live on our future development. Of course, there's tons of impacts, there are tons of consequences, and that's what the queen bee is actually teaching us by her nuptial flight, the fact that she's waiting for just that perfect day, that beautiful, sunny, bright day. So for me, this is priceless to understand and to know, and of course, it's highly therapeutical. And I know many people think about apitherapy not including that type of notion, but for me, this is vital. This is something that the bees are teaching us. It might be a bit subtle, but I think there are many more things that are really subtle that we don't know about bees, and we don't know about so many things that could help healing us, and that's one of them. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And of course, if you have questions, comments, whatever, please go ahead and put them as comments on this video. This channel is really young. If you appreciate the topic, Please share. Any help would be welcome. Of course, you can subscribe also to follow and see when will the next video come out. There's a few other videos as well. If it's your first time on the channel, take a time to watch over the other videos. There are other videos that are really interesting, you'll like, I'm sure. So thank you very much for your time and for appreciating the work, and see you another time for another Apitherapy video.